Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood alone at the observation deck of the small human vessel called the Starward Hope, watching the massive space station grow larger against the endless black of space, and she felt her heart beat faster with every passing second as the structure came into view. The station was called the Grand Assembly, and it served as the center of all galactic civilization, a place where 47 different species came together to govern the stars and maintain peace across thousands of worlds. And Elena had seen images of it before, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer size of this place that hung in the void like a metal moon. She had been chosen as humanity's ambassador to the galactic conquered 3 years ago, and in that time she had learned many things about the galaxy and the beings who lived in it, and the most important lesson was simple: nobody cared about humans, not really, because humanity was young and small and had only discovered faster than light travel 18 years before. 18 years was nothing to species who counted their history in millions of years, and to them humans were like children who had just learned to walk. Cute perhaps and interesting in their own way, but not worthy of serious attention or respect. The door behind her opened with a soft hiss, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen walked in, his boots clicking against the metal floor as he came to stand beside her at the wind. "We are approaching the docking bay, Ambassador," he said in his calm and steady voice. "The station has granted us permission to land in Section 47. Elena nodded, but did not turn away from the view, her eyes fixed on the thousands of ships that moved around the station like tiny insects around a hive, each one carrying beings from worlds she had never seen and probably never would. "Have you read the latest intelligence reports?" she asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a moment before answering. "I have, Ambassador, and I wish I could say the information was wrong, but our sources are reliable. The information was about the Breath Dominion, a species from the far eastern spiral of the galaxy, a region that remained largely unexplored by the conquered and its member species, and for the past several decades the Breath had been doing something terrible. They had been conquering worlds, not through diplomacy or trade or cultural exchange, but through war and death and fire, sweeping across the fringe systems like a plague and leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. And the few survivors who escaped told stories that made Elena's blood run cold. Stories of cities burning under orbital bombardment, of families torn apart, of entire civilizations erased from existence because they did not meet the Breath definition of worthy life. Elena had gathered all the evidence she could find over the past 2 years, intercepted communications and survivor testimonies, and satellite images of worlds that had once been green and blue and were now nothing but scorched rock. And she had requested this emergency session with the Galactic Council to present what she had learned. The Council had given her 15 minutes to convince ancient beings who had never known war that a storm was coming, that everything they had built over 3,000 years of peace was about to be tested in ways they could not imagine. "Do you think they will listen?" Marcus asked. Elena finally turned away from the window and looked at her aide with tired eyes. "No, I do not think they will listen, but I have to try anyway, because that is what humans do. We try even when the odds are Against us, the Starward Hope docked at the station 20 minutes later, and Elena walked through the airlock into a world that seemed designed to make her feel small and insignificant. The corridors of the Grand Assembly were enormous, built to accommodate species of all sizes, from the tiny Kelish who stood no taller than her knee to the massive Torvani who could have crushed her with a single hand, and the walls were decorated with art and symbols from 1,000 different cultures. Everywhere she looked, she saw aliens, beings of crystal and light and liquid, metal and flesh, and things she had no words for, all of them moving with purpose through the halls of power, and none of them gave her more than a passing glance. To them she was just another human, a member of that young and foolish species that had stumbled into the stars without understanding how things worked out here. She made her way to the council chamber with Marcus at her side, passing through security checkpoints manned by the Valoran Guard, tall and stern warriors in gleaming armor who served as the peacekeepers of the conquered. The chamber itself was a vast circular room with seats arranged in rising tiers around a central platform, and as Elena entered she saw that most of the seats were empty, because this emergency session was considered a minor matter unworthy of full attendance. High Arbiter Thesson sat at the highest tier, a being of living crystal whose form caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across the walls, and the Arbiter had led the council for over 600 years and was considered the wisest being in known space. Elena took her place at the central platform and looked up at the scattered delegates who had bothered to attend, seeing boredom in their alien faces and impatience in the way they shifted in their seats. The council recognizes Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Human Coalition, Thesson said in a voice like wind chimes. You have requested this session to present information regarding the Breath Dominion. You may proceed. Elena took a deep breath and began to speak, projecting images and data onto the holographic displays around her. As she told them everything she knew, she showed them the intercepted communication where Breath commanders discussed the extermination of inferior species. She played the testimonies of survivors who had watched their families die. She displayed the satellite images of burning worlds and mass graves and cities reduced to rubble. She spoke for her full 15 minutes, and when she finished the chamber was silent. Then Ambassador Kreloth of the Sithari rose from his seat, a being of pale blue skin and large dark eyes whose species had achieved perfect logic millennia ago and considered themselves the intellectual masters of the galaxy. The data you have presented is incomplete, he said in his cold and measured voice. These events occurred in regions outside conquered jurisdiction, and we cannot verify the accuracy of your sources. Furthermore, the Breath have made no hostile moves toward any conquered member world because they are not ready yet, Elena replied, fighting to keep her frustration under control. They are building their strength, consolidating their conquests before they move against us. The Melori delegate spoke next, being a flowing liquid metal who could reshape their form at will. Humanity has been part of galactic civilization for less than 2 decades. You do not have the perspective to understand how these matters work. The conquered has faced many perceived threats over the millennia, and patience and diplomacy have always prevailed. Elena wanted to scream at them, to grab them by their shoulders and shake them until they understood, but she knew that would only prove their point about humans being primitive and emotional. I'm telling you that war is coming, she said as calmly as she could manage. The breath will not stop until they have conquered everything. High Arbiter Thesson made a soft chiming sound that signaled the end of discussion. The Council thanks the human delegation for their vigilance. We will continue to monitor the situation through appropriate channels. This session is concluded. And just like that it was over. Elena stood alone on the platform as the delegates filed out, not one of them looking back at her, not one of them caring about the evidence she had shown or the warning she had given. Marcus was waiting outside the chamber with a secured tablet in his hands and a grim expression on his face. Ambassador, our long-range sensors just detected something, he said quietly so no one else could hear. A breath war fleet 400 vessels strong. They will reach the outer colonies in 6 weeks. Elena felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like a physical burden, because she had known this moment would come, but knowing did not make it easier. They are not going to help us, she said, looking back at the empty chamber. They do not believe the threat is real. What do we do? Elena took the tablet from his hands and looked at the data, at the massive fleet that was even now moving toward everything she loved, and she made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. We prepare, she said with steel in her voice. Alone if we have to. The days that followed Elena's failed presentation to the Council were filled with frustration and growing despair, and she spent long hours in her small office on the station, sending messages to Earth and receiving reports that only confirmed her worst fears. The breath fleet was moving faster than anyone had expected, cutting through the empty space between the stars with a hunger that could not be satisfied, and every day brought them closer to the worlds that humanity had worked so hard to build. Elena requested another meeting with the Council, then another and another, but each time she was told that the matter was under review and that the proper procedures had to be followed before any action could be taken. The proper procedures could take months, sometimes years, because the Galactic Concord had been built on the idea that patience was always better than haste, and that violence was never the answer to any problem. She tried meeting with individual delegates in private, hoping that one-on-one conversations might convince them where her public presentation had failed, but the results were always the same. Ambassador Krelvoth of the Sithari listened politely to her arguments and then explained in his cold, logical way that the probability of the breath attacking conquered space was too low to justify military preparation, and that humans simply lacked the mathematical understanding to properly assess risk. The Malari delegate was even worse, suggesting that Elena's concerns were the result of humanity's primitive fear response, and that with time her species would evolve past such emotional reactions. You are like children afraid of shadows, the Maori said with what might have been a kind smile. If liquid metal could smile, the galaxy is not as dangerous as you believe. Elena wanted to show them the faces of the survivors. She had interviewed the mothers who had watched their children die, the fathers who had lost everything, but she knew it would make no difference because these beings had never known loss like that. 3,000 years of peace had made them soft and blind, unable to see the darkness that was coming because they had forgotten that darkness existed. 2 weeks after her first presentation, something happened that Elena had been dreading and hoping for at the same time. The Conquered received a message from the Breath Dominion. It was the first official communication between the two powers, and the Council immediately called an emergency session that was actually well attended because everyone was curious about these mysterious conquerors from the Eastern Spiral. Elena sat in the observer section with Marcus beside her, watching as High Orbiter Thesson activated the holographic display and played the recorded message for all to see. Breath Commander, who appeared on the screen, was terrifying in a way that went beyond physical appearance, tall and covered in dark scales with 4 arms and a face full of sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that made Elena's blood run cold. Those eyes held nothing, no mercy, no compassion, no recognition that the beings watching might be anything other than obstacles to be removed. "We are the Breath Dominion," the commander said in a voice that had been translated into the common galactic language but still carried an alien coldness. "We have claimed the Eastern territories as our own, and we will soon expand our righteous domain into the space you call the Conquered." A murmur went through the chamber, but Thesson raised a crystalline hand for silence. "You have a choice," the Breath continued. "Submit to our rule and accept your place as servants of the Dominion, or resist and be destroyed. We give you this warning as a courtesy, because we believe it is right to offer the weak a chance to surrender before we crush them." The message ended, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Ambassador Krelvoth rose from his seat with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime believing in the power of reason. "This is clearly a negotiating tactic. The Verith are attempting to establish a strong position before discussions begin. We should respond with a diplomatic envoy to open formal talks." Elena could not believe what she was hearing. "Did you watch the same message I did? They are not interested in negotiation. They are telling us to surrender or die." Ambassador Vasquez, "Please," Thesson said with a disapproving chime. "Outbursts of this nature are not helpful. The Council will handle this matter through established channels." The established channels turned out to be exactly what Kavoth had suggested. Diplomatic envoy consisting of 3 ships and 12 ambassadors from different species sent to meet with the Verith and establish a framework for peaceful coexistence. Elena begged them not to send the envoy, warning them that the Verith would see it as weakness and respond with violence, but no one listened to the young human who had only been in space for 18 years. The envoy departed 4 days later with great ceremony and high hopes. It was destroyed 3 days after that. The Breath did not bother to communicate or demand surrender. They simply opened fire the moment the envoy ships came within weapons range, and within minutes 12 ambassadors and 300 crew members were dead. The news reached the Grand Assembly like a shockwave, spreading through the corridors and chambers and shattering the comfortable certainty that had defined life in the Conquered for 3 millennia. Elena was in her office when she heard, and she felt no satisfaction in being right, because there was no victory in this kind of truth, only grief for the dead and fear for what was coming next. The Council called another emergency session, and this time every seat was filled, every delegate present, every face showing some version of shock or confusion or the beginning of real fear. High Arbiter Thesson opened the session with a voice that was less steady than before. The Council acknowledges the loss of our diplomatic envoy and extends condolences to the families of those who died in service to peace. Peace, Alina said, rising from her seat without permission because she was done with permission and protocols and proper procedures. There will be no peace with the breath. There was never going to be peace. I told you this weeks ago, and you refused to listen. Ambassador Vasquez, you are out of order, Thesson said, but there was less certainty in the reprimand than there once would have been. Yes, I'm out of order because order is not going to save us from what is coming. Alina walked down the stairs toward the central platform, ignoring the protests of the delegates around her. I presented evidence of breath aggression and you dismissed it. I warned you that they would not negotiate, and you sent an envoy anyway. And now 12 good people are dead because you were too proud and too comfortable to face the truth. She reached the platform and turned to face the full assembly, seeing hundreds of alien faces staring back at her with expressions she could not fully read. The Breath Fleet is 4 weeks away from the outer colonies. 30 million humans live in those systems, and after they destroy us, they will move on to your worlds one by one until there is nothing left. The Torvani ambassador, a massive being with 6 arms and a face like a scarred boulder, spoke for the first time in any session Alina had attended. What would you have us do, human? We have no armies, no war fleets. We gave up such things long ago because we believed we had grown beyond them. Then you have to remember, Alina said. You have to remember what you were before you decided that peace meant pretending war did not exist. She looked around the chamber one more time, knowing that her words were falling on ears that might never truly hear, and then she turned and walked toward the exit. Where are you going? Thesson called after her. Alina paused at the door and looked back at the crystalline being who had led the galaxy into a comfortable blindness. I am going to do what the conquered will not. I am going to prepare my people for war. And with those words she left the chamber, and Marcus followed her, and together they made their way back to the Starward Hope with a terrible weight on their shoulders and a fierce determination in their hearts. Humanity would stand alone if it had to, but it would stand. The message went out across every human world at the same moment, carried by faster than light transmissions to colonies and stations, and ships scattered across the darkness between stars. Alina had recorded it herself, sitting in a bare room on the Starward Hope with nothing but a camera and the weight of everything she needed to say. My fellow humans, she began, I am speaking to you today because a storm is coming. A threat unlike anything our species has ever faced, and the galaxy has chosen to look away while the darkness approaches. She told them about the breath in their conquests, about the council and their blindness, about the fleet that was even now moving toward the outer colonies with 400 warships and a hunger for destruction. We asked for help and help was denied. She said we presented evidence and evidence was ignored. We watched as diplomats were murdered and still the galaxy refuses to act, so now we must act ourselves. The message spread like fire across dry grass, jumping from world to world, and station to station until every human being in the galaxy had heard the ambassador's words, and something remarkable happened on Earth. Governments that had spent decades arguing over borders and resources and old grudges suddenly found common ground in the face of extinction, and within 3 days the United Nations had granted emergency powers to a unified military command that brought together every fleet and army and militia under a single banner. On Mars, the terraforming engineers who had spent their lives making the red planet green turned their skills toward weapons research, and laboratories that had been working on atmosphere generators began designing shield technology and improved missiles. On Luna, the shipyards that built exploration vessels and cargo haulers and passenger liners received new orders, and workers began the around-the-clock shifts that would be needed to convert civilian ships into something that could fight. Elena returned to Earth aboard a fast courier ship, making the journey in just 4 days instead of the usual 2 weeks, and when she arrived she found a world transformed by purpose. Admiral James Ainquo met her at the spaceport in Geneva, a tall man with gray hair and scars on his face from a war that had ended 30 years before, and his handshake was firm and his eyes were steady. Ambassador Vasquez, he said, I have read your reports and I believe everything you have told us, but I need you to understand what we are facing. They walked together through corridors filled with rushing officers and technicians, passing screens that showed fleet positions and production schedules, and casualty projections that made Elena's stomach turn. We have 93 combat-capable vessels, Ainquo continued. The breath have 400 that we know of, probably more in reserve. Our technology is roughly equal, but their experience in actual warfare is vastly greater because we have not fought a real war in over a century. So what do we do? Elena asked. Ainquo stopped walking and looked at her with the calm certainty of a man who had already made peace with what might come. We do what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds. We fight. Anyway, the next 2 weeks were a blur of activity that seemed to compress time itself. Every hour filled with 1,000 decisions and 1,000,000 small acts of courage from people who knew they might be preparing for their own deaths. Elena traveled from world to world, speaking to crowds of volunteers and workers and soldiers, reminding them why they fought and what they were protecting. On the mining colonies of the asteroid belt, she watched rough men and women who had spent their lives digging ore from rocks sign up for military service, their hands calloused from labor and their eyes bright with determination. On the research stations orbiting Jupiter, she saw scientists working without sleep to develop new weapons and countermeasures, pushing the boundaries of physics and engineering because failure meant the end of everything. On the outer colonies themselves, she helped coordinate evacuation efforts for civilians who could not or would not fight, loading millions of people onto transport ships that would carry them to safer systems further from the approaching storm. But not everyone left. On Kilani's Prime, the largest of the outer colonies with a population of 18 million, Elena met a woman named Sarah Chen, who ran a small restaurant near the spaceport and who had refused every offer of evacuation. My grandfather built this restaurant when the colony was just a few domes on a barren rock, Sarah said as she served Elena a cup of tea. He came here because He believed in the future and building something that would last, and I am not going to abandon his dream because some aliens think they can take it from us. There were thousands like Sarah across the outer colonies, ordinary people who chose to stay and fight for their homes. And Alina drew strength from their courage even as she feared for their lives. Meanwhile, the Galactic Council continued to debate. Alina received regular updates from Marcus, who had stayed behind at the Grand Assembly to monitor developments, and each report was more frustrating than the last. They are still discussing the proper response, Marcus told her during one late-night communication. Ambassador Kavoth proposed a strongly worded resolution condemning the breath attack on the diplomatic envoy, and they have been arguing about the exact wording for 3 days. 3 days, Alina repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. The breath fleet will reach Kelani's in 2 weeks, and they are arguing about words. There is some movement among the Torvani delegation, Marcus added, a hint of hope in his voice. Their ambassador has been asking questions about human military capabilities and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. The Torvani were an interesting case, Alina knew, because unlike most conquered species, they had not always been peaceful, and their ancient history was filled with wars and conquests that they had supposedly moved beyond when they joined the galactic community. Perhaps they remembered something that the others had forgotten. Admiral Aenquo presented his battle plan to Alina and the Unified Command 3 days before the Breath Fleet was expected to arrive at Kelani's. We cannot win a straight fight, he said, pointing to holographic displays that showed the relative positions of the two fleets. They outnumber us 4-1, and their ships are designed for war, while many of ours were passenger vessels. Month ago, then how do we win? Asked General Martinez, the commander of ground forces. We do not try to win, Aenquillo replied. We try to survive. We make them pay for every inch of space. We hit them and run, and hit them again until they bleed so much that continuing the attack becomes too costly. It was a desperate strategy, the kind of plan that only made sense when all other options had failed, but it was the only strategy they had. Alina looked at the faces around the table, soldiers and commanders and politicians, who had come together in humanity's darkest hour, and she saw fear in their eyes, but also something stronger. She saw resolve. There is one more thing I need to do, she said, before the battle begins. I need to go back to the Grand Assembly and address the Council one more time. Why? Aquo asked. They have made their position clear because they need to hear the truth, Alina said, not reports or data or diplomatic language. They need someone to look them in the eyes and tell them exactly what they are facing, and maybe, just maybe, some of them will remember who they used to be. She left for the Grand Assembly the next morning, traveling aboard the fastest ship available, knowing that time was running out and that everything depended on what happened next. The breath were coming, and the galaxy needed to wake up. Alina was going to be the alarm. The council chamber was fuller than Alina had ever seen it, every seat occupied by delegates from all 47 member species, and the air itself seemed heavy with tension as she walked down the central stairs toward the speaking platform. She had requested this emergency session through official channels and had been surprised when High Arbiter Thesson granted it immediately, but she understood why when she looked up at the assembled beings and saw fear in faces that had never known fear before. Word had spread through the galaxy about humanity's preparations for war, about the ships being converted and the soldiers being trained and the ordinary people who had chosen to stay and fight. And it had disturbed the comfortable peace that the conquered had enjoyed for 3,000 years, the idea that anyone would actually fight, would actually choose violence over surrender or negotiation, was alien to these beings in a way that went beyond species or biology. Elena reached the platform and stood there for a moment, looking around at the crystalline forms and liquid metal, bodies and logical minds that had ruled the galaxy for longer than humanity had existed as a species. She had prepared remarks carefully, written speeches designed to appeal to their sense of reason and self-interest. But standing there in that moment, she realized that careful words were not going to be enough. They needed to feel something, needed to understand in their hearts what their minds refused to accept. "You are afraid," she said, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. "I can see it in the way you sit, in the way you look at me, in the silence that fills this room like water filling a sinking ship." A murmur went through the assembly, but no one interrupted her. "You are afraid because you have heard what humanity is doing, because you cannot understand why we would choose to fight when the odds are so clearly against us, because the very concept of war is something you have tried so hard to forget." She activated the holographic displays around her, showing images of human ships gathering at Kilani's, of soldiers training in the corridors of stations, of civilians refusing to evacuate their homes. "In 4 days, the Verith fleet will arrive at the Kilani system, 400 warships against our 93, and they will try to burn everything we have built in that corner of space." Ambassador Vasquez, High Arbiter Thesson, said, "If you have come to request military assistance from the conquered, you must understand that we simply do not have." "I have not come to request anything," Elena interrupted, her voice sharp and strong. "I am done requesting, done begging, done trying to convince beings who have chosen blindness over sight." The chamber went completely silent. "I have come to tell you what humanity is going to do, and to give you one final chance to remember what you have forgotten." She walked to the edge of the platform and pointed up at the assembled delegates, her finger moving from section to section as she spoke. "The Sithari were conquerors once. Your history records tell of the logic wars, when your ancestors swept across a dozen star systems in pursuit of perfect order. You gave up war because you calculated that peace was more efficient, not because you were incapable of violence." Ambassador Krelvoth shifted uncomfortably in his seat but did not respond. The Melori evolved in the depths of volcanic oceans, fighting every day just to survive against predators and pressure and heat that would kill any human in seconds. You did not become what you are through peace but through struggle. The liquid metal delegate rippled but remained silent, and the Torvani, Elena, turned to face the massive six-armed beings who sat in their section like statues carved from living stone. "Your ancestors conquered half a galaxy before you joined the conquered. You were the most feared warriors in known space, and now you sit in comfortable chairs, pretending you have evolved beyond such primitive behavior." The Torvani ambassador stirred, his deep voice Rumbling through the chamber, you speak. Boldly for one so young human, I speak. The truth, Elena replied, which is more than this council has done since I arrived. She turned back to face the crystalline being who had led the galaxy into 3,000 years of peace and was now watching that peace crumble. You built the conquered on a beautiful idea, the belief that intelligent beings could choose cooperation over conflict, that war was a disease that civilization could cure, but you made a terrible mistake. Elena paused, letting the silence stretch until every being in the chamber was focused entirely on her. You assumed that everyone else shared your belief. You assumed that every species in the galaxy would eventually see the wisdom of peace. You forgot that some beings do not want peace. Some beings only understand strength, and some beings will keep taking and killing and conquering until someone stops them. She activated the final holographic display, showing the Breath War fleet in all its terrible glory, 400 ships bristling with weapons and filled with soldiers who had been raised from birth to believe that conquest was their divine right. The Breath are coming, and they will not stop. At the outer colonies, after they destroy us, they will move on to the Kelani system, and then to Cthari Prime, and then to every world in the conquered, until there is nothing left but their empire. What would you have us do? Thesson asked, and for the first time there was something other than calm certainty in the Arbiter's voice. We have no weapons, no armies. We gave them up long ago. Then remember how to fight, Elena said. Remember what your ancestors knew. Remember that peace is not the absence of war, but the victory over it. Remember that freedom is not given, but earned. She straightened her back and spoke the words that would echo through galactic history, the words that every child in every civilization would learn for generations to come. The time for diplomacy has ended, she declared, her voice ringing through the chamber like a bell. The time for war has come. Chamber erupted in chaos, delegates shouting in a dozen languages, some calling for her removal and others sitting in stunned silence. But Elena stood firm at the center of the storm. Humanity will fight, she continued, raising her voice above the noise. We will meet the Breath at Kalani's, and we will hold them there, or we will die trying. We are not asking for your permission. We are not requesting your approval. We are telling you that this is what we are going to do. She looked around the chamber one more time, meeting every eye she could find. And we are asking if you want to survive. Because if we fall, you are next, and you have forgotten how to defend yourselves. For a long moment, no one moved. Future of the galaxy balanced on a knife's edge, and then something remarkable happened. The Torvani ambassador rose from his seat, all six of his massive arms spreading wide in a gesture that Elena did not recognize. But that sent a gasp through the chamber. The human speaks truth, the Torvani said, his deep voice silencing every other sound. We have grown soft. We have forgotten the lessons our ancestors paid for in blood. We have hidden from this threat because we were afraid to remember what we once were. He turned to face Elena, and in his ancient eyes she saw something that had been sleeping for a very long time, finally beginning to wake. The Torvani will fight alongside humanity, he declared. We will remember who we were, and we will show these Breath what happens to those who threaten the innocent. The chamber exploded into noise again, but this time it was Different, this time there was something else mixed with the fear and confusion. Hope, one by one other delegations began to rise. The CFT with their armored shells and the Valorans with their gleaming weapons, and even the logical Cthari who had calculated the odds and realized that unity was their only chance of survival. By the time the session ended, 23 species had pledged their support to the war effort, ships and soldiers and resources that would join humanity's desperate stand against the darkness. Elena watched them go, watched beings who had never known war begin to prepare for battle, and she felt the weight of what she had done settle onto her shoulders. She had changed the galaxy. With her words had awakened something that had been sleeping for 3,000 years. And now she had to make sure that awakening was not in vain. The Battle of Kelanis was 4 days away, and everything depended on what happened next. The stars around Kelanis Prime were filled with ships, human vessels flying alongside Torvani warships and Cthari cruisers and craft from a dozen other species, all of them waiting in formation for an enemy that would arrive at any moment. Admiral James Ayanquo stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance, humanity's flagship, watching the tactical displays that showed the positions of every ship in the combined fleet, 260 vessels, against the VH Armada of 400. The odds were still terrible, but they were better than they had been a week ago when humanity had stood alone. Admiral, the Vreth fleet has entered the system, reported his tactical officer, young woman named Lieutenant Park, whose hands were steady despite the fear that must have been running through her veins. They will be in weapons range in 20 minutes. Ayanquo nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the red dots that represented death and destruction. Approaching at incredible speed. Signal all ships to hold formation. Nobody fires until I give the order. Around him, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, humans and aliens operating together in ways that would have seemed impossible just weeks before, and Ayanquo felt a strange pride in what they had accomplished. The Torvani warriors who manned the secondary weapon stations were fierce beings who had rediscovered their warrior heritage, their 6 arms moving across control panels with a speed and precision that human hands could never match. The Cthari analysts who calculated firing solutions and predicted enemy movements were cold and logical but absolutely reliable, their minds processing data faster than any computer. The Malari engineers who kept the ship running had literally merged themselves with the engine systems, their liquid metal bodies flowing through conduits and cables to make repairs that would normally take hours. In mere minutes, they were different species from different worlds with different histories, but in this moment, they were one fleet fighting for one cause. Ambassador Elena Vasquez's face appeared on the main viewscreen, broadcasting from the command ship at the rear of the formation where she had insisted on being, despite every argument Ayanquo had made about her safety. Admiral, the Breath Commander, is attempting to communicate, she said. I think they want to offer us one last chance to surrender, put them through, Akono said. Let everyone what we are fighting against. Breath Commander appeared on screen, the same terrible figure from the message that had started everything, scales dark as space and eyes empty of anything resembling mercy. You have gathered allies, the commander observed with what might have been amusement. It will not matter, you are still weak, still divided, still clinging to the pathetic hope that you can resist the inevitable. Elena stepped forward so that the breath could see her clearly. This is Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Human Coalition, speaking for the United Fleet of the Galactic Concord. I remember you, the commander said. You were the one who tried to warn them. They one they did not believe. A pity they did not listen. You might have had more time to prepare. They listened. Eventually, Elena replied, and now we are here not to negotiate, not to surrender, but to fight. You will die. Maybe, Elena acknowledged, but we will not die quietly, and we will not die alone, and before this day is over you will learn something that your species has forgotten. And what is that? Elena's voice was cold and hard as steel when she answered that there are worse things in the galaxy than the breath. The channel cut off and the battle began. The first wave of breath ships came in, fast and aggressive, expecting the Allied fleet to break and scatter as every other enemy had done. But the combined forces held their formation and met the attack with concentrated fire. Human missiles and Torvani plasma weapons and Cithari precision lasers tore through the breath vanguard, destroying ships that had expected easy targets and found instead a wall of death. The Defiance led the charge, Ayanquo pushing his ship into the heart of the enemy formation in a move so reckless that the breath commanders could not process it. And where the flagship went, the rest of the fleet followed. Ships exploded on both sides, brief flowers of fire, blooming in the darkness only to fade into nothing. And with each death, the survivors fought harder, knowing that their fallen comrades had bought them precious seconds. The Torvani warships were brutal in close combat, their crews boarding enemy vessels and fighting hand to hand through corridors filled with smoke and blood. And the ancient warriors showed the breath what 3,000 years of suppressed aggression looked like when finally released. The Cithari worked together in perfect coordination, their ships moving as one mind, predicting enemy movements and exploiting weaknesses with mathematical precision that turned the chaos of battle into something almost beautiful. Even the peaceful Melari contributed, their shape-shifting bodies forming living shields around damaged ships, absorbing weapons fire until they could absorb no more and sacrificing themselves so that others might survive. But the breath kept coming, wave after wave of ships pouring into the battle zone, and slowly the Allied fleet began to take losses that could not be replaced. Ayanquo watched as ship after ship fell, silent on his tactical display, human and alien crews dying together in the cold void of space, and he knew that the battle could not continue much longer. Admiral, we are losing cohesion on the left flank, Lieutenant Park reported, her voice strained but steady. The Kree squadron has taken heavy damage. Send the reserve wing to reinforce them, Ayanquo ordered, and signal the Defiance squadron to begin attack pattern Omega. Attack pattern Omega was a desperate gamble, a final push that would drive the flagship and its escorts directly at the Vreth command ship in hopes of cutting off the head of the enemy fleet. It was almost certainly a suicide mission, and everyone on the bridge knew it. Admiral, the communications officer, called out, Ambassador Vasquez is requesting to speak with you. Ayanquo activated the private channel, and Elena's face appeared on his personal screen, her expression a mixture of grief and determination. You are going after their flagship, she said, and it was not a question, it is the only way, Akono replied, if we can destroy their commander, the rest of the fleet may retreat. And if you die, then I die doing what humans have always done, the admiral said with a sad smile. Fighting for what I believe in. Elena was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. It has been an honor, Admiral. The honor was mine. Ambassador, tell them what happened here. Tell them that we did not go quietly. The channel closed and Ayanquo turned to his crew, seeing the faces of men and women and beings who had chosen to follow him into the darkness. All hands, this is the Admiral, he announced over the shipwide communication system. We are about to do something very stupid and very brave. Anyone who wants to leave is free to do so. No one will think less of you. No one moved. Then let us show these breath what happens when you threaten humanity. The Defiant surged forward, engines burning at maximum power, and its escort ships followed in a wedge formation that cut through the enemy fleet like a blade. Breath vessels tried to intercept them, but the human ships were faster and more maneuverable, weaving through weapons, fire, and debris with a skill that came from desperation and determination. The enemy flagship grew larger on the view screen, a massive vessel bristling with weapons that could destroy a planet, and Ayanquo knew that they would only get one chance. All weapons fire. Everything, he ordered, and the Defiant unleashed a storm of missiles and energy beams that lit up the darkness like a second sun. The breath flagship shields flickered and died under the concentrated assault. And for one perfect moment, Ayanquo could see the hull beginning to buckle under the pressure. Then a breath cruiser slammed into the Defiance from behind, and the world became fire and pain. The explosion of the two ships triggered a chain reaction that engulfed the breath flagship as well, and when the light faded, there was nothing left but expanding clouds of debris across the battlefield. The breath fleet hesitated. Their commander was dead, their flagship destroyed, and the enemy they had expected to roll over was still fighting with a ferocity they had never encountered. One by one, the breath ships began to break off, turning away from the battle and retreating toward the edge of the system, and a ragged cheer went up from the surviving Allied vessels. They had won. The Battle of Kilanis was over, and though the cost had been terrible, the combined fleet had achieved the impossible and turned back the darkness. Elena Vasquez watched from her command ship as the breath fleet disappeared into hyperspace, carrying word of their defeat back to their home world, and she wept for all those who had died to make this moment possible. 1 month later, she stood before the Galactic Council once more, but this time everything was different. A new seat had been added to the inner circle of the chamber, a seat for humanity, and Elena took her place there among the elder races who had finally remembered what it meant to fight. High Arbiter Theson's crystalline form chimed softly as the session began. The Council formally recognizes the human coalition as a full member of the Galactic Concord. Your people have shown us something we had forgotten, that peace is not the absence of strength but its highest expression. Elena thought of Admiral Ayanquo and the thousands who had given their lives at Kilanis, of the long road that still lay ahead because the breath were wounded but not destroyed, and she knew that the galaxy would never be the same. We did not come to the stars to conquer, she said quietly. We came to find our place among you. We came as friends and explorers. But know this, we will never hesitate to fight for what we believe in. She looked around the chamber at the allies who had been forged in fire, at beings who had remembered their ancient strength, because a young species had reminded them of what courage looked like, and now neither will you. The galaxy had changed, the age of comfortable peace was over, and a new era had begun, an era where humanity stood among the stars, not as newcomers but as equals, not as observers but as leaders, not as children but as warriors who had shown the ancient races that sometimes the youngest voice speaks the loudest truth. The age of humanity had begun, and the stars themselves seemed to shine a little brighter in welcome. The recording lasted 41 minutes. It was found inside a small black box drifting near the ash cloud that used to be Heaven Colony. The box was scorched on 3 sides. Its signal was weak. It took a recovery drone 6 days to locate it and another 2 days to crack the encryption. When the audio finally played inside the secured briefing room on Earth, no one spoke for a long time. After it ended, the voice on the recording belonged to a woman named Gon. She was the colonial administrator of Heaven, a quiet, careful woman who had spent 8 years helping build the colony from a dust field into a real home for over 4 million people. She had schools on her registry, hospitals, a small university that had just opened its second building 2 months before the attack. When the Veil fleet arrived, Gon did not run. She did not try to broadcast a distress signal because she knew one would never arrive in time. Instead, she sat down at her desk, opened the colony's population record, and started reading names into a recorder. She read them in order, street by street, building by building, her voice calm and flat and steady, even as the windows behind her glowed orange, and the walls shook and the lights flickered and died. She read for 41 minutes. The recording ended mid-name. Admiral DeHaan sat alone in the briefing room for a long time after the others left. She was not a woman who showed much on her face. She had commanded 3 deep space operations, had lost ships and crew, had written letters to families she would never meet. She knew what grief looked like when it wore uniform. She had worn it herself, but this was something different. This was not a battle. There had been no warning, no declaration, no ultimatum. The Dominion had simply decided that a human colony on the edge of their preferred expansion corridor was inconvenient, and they had removed it the way you remove a weed, without ceremony, without hesitation, and without any expectation of consequence. The message Ambassador Ration sent to Earth Command afterward was brief. It compared humanity to livestock. It told them to stay inside their borders. It was written in the tone of someone who had never once imagined that the thing they were speaking to might write back. Day read it once, then she folded it, put it in a drawer, and went to make a call that very few people on Earth knew. She was authorized to make the call, connected to a facility that did not appear on any public map. The man on the other end looked like he had just woken up, which he had. He had been in cryos suspension for nearly 3 years waiting. His name was Janho. He was not large or loud or impressive looking. He had a thin face, short hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that were very still. and very dark. He looked at Dayan through the screen without surprise, as if he had been expecting her call since the moment he went under. She told him the number 4.3 million. He was quiet for 4 seconds, then he said, "Get me my crew." The United Earth Navy had built the ship in secret. She had no listing on any public naval registry, no press announcement, no name on any official document that could be accessed without the highest level of clearance. She existed in a category of her own, not a deterrent, not a peacekeeping vessel, not a diplomatic escort. She had been built for a single purpose that no one in any public office was willing to say out loud. She was the answer to a question humanity hoped it would never have to ask, and now the question had been asked at a cost of 4.3 million lives, and the answer was already docked and waiting. Her name was no more civility. Junho walked her full length on the first day and said nothing. She was not beautiful the way some ships were beautiful. She did not have clean lines or elegant proportions. She was dense and angular and dark, built without a single gram of wasted material, every surface either armored or armed or both. She looked, one engineer once said, like something that had decided to become a weapon and had committed to it completely. The crew came in over the next week. They were not recruited from the top of any graduation list. They were pulled from quiet postings and medical holds, and in 2 cases from personal requests for indefinite leave that nobody had questioned because nobody wanted to ask why Salmon arrived first. She was the weapons officer, and she had been one of 63 people to survive the heaven ground defense response, a response that had lasted approximately 4 minutes before the orbital fire made it irrelevant. She had escaped on a cargo hauler with 11 others, 8 of whom did not make it to the evacuation point. She had not filed a single complaint, had not requested counseling, had not spoken to any journalist or memorial committee or government panel. She had simply returned to duty, gone very quiet, and waited. When the call came, she packed a single bag and was aboard before anyone else. Wuho came next. He was the chief engineer and the man who had designed the ship's primary weapon, a system called the Cradle Breaker Array, which 3 separate military review boards had described as either brilliant or catastrophic, depending on which side of the firing line you were on. He was messy and talkative and always had grease under his fingernails, and he was the only person aboard who seemed genuinely excited to be there, which everyone else found either comforting or unsettling. Kiwen was the navigator. She was 24 years old. Her mother and 2 younger brothers had been on KO-7. She had been off-world on a training rotation when the attack happened, and she had spent the following weeks in a kind of mechanical silence, eating, sleeping, running diagnostics, doing everything a person does without doing any of it with feeling. When she stepped aboard the asterisk, no more civility. She touched the hull once with the flat of her hand, very briefly, and then walked inside without looking back. Dr. Arena was the last to arrive. She was the ship's physician and also the foremost human expert on veil biology, their nerve structures, their pressure points, their specific physiological responses to pain and fear. She had spent 12 years studying them under the banner of xenomical research. She had never been asked to apply that knowledge in a military context before. She did not hesitate when she was asked. Now Junho gathered them on the bridge the night before launch. He did not give a speech. He did not talk about duty or sacrifice or justice. He looked at each of them for a moment, and then he said quietly, "They think we're going to grieve. Let's go tell them what we actually do." The ship left the dock at 300 hours. No escort, no signal, snorts, no record in any system that would be reviewed for a very long time. The stars outside were cold and many, and the no more civility moved into them, like something that had been patient for long enough. The Veiled Dominion had not fought a real war in over 200 years. This was not because they were peaceful. It was because no one had ever been stupid enough or desperate enough or angry enough to start one with them. They were large and old and very well armed, and they had spent centuries making sure every civilization within reach understood exactly what those three things meant when combined. They did not need to fight, they only needed to remind people occasionally that they could. The destruction of He Colony had been a reminder, a small one in their estimation, a nudge, the kind of thing you do to a creature that has wandered too close, not out of malice but out of simple convenience. They had not expected a response. They had not prepared for one. Why would they? Humanity was barely 200 years into space travel. They had a handful of colonies, a modest navy, and a history of arguing with each other more than with anyone else. The Veil High Conclave reviewed the situation, noted that Earth Command had gone silent following the attack, and concluded that the matter was resolved. They were still concluding this when Border Station Velun disappeared. It happened at 3:14 hours station time. One moment was there. 12,000 personnel, full defensive grid, patrol wings running standard rotations, the whole quiet machinery of a functioning military hub. The next moment, every sensor in the surrounding sector registered a single massive energy event, and then nothing. No debris field large enough to identify, no survivors, no distress signal, because there had been no time to send one. The no more civility was already gone before the nearest Veil patrol ship arrived to look at the empty space where Velen used to be. On the bridge, Salmon lowered her hands from the firing controls and looked at the readout for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her console and began running a reset cycle on the cradle breaker array. Her face was very still. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Janho stood at the center of the bridge, watching the data feed as Kiwin plotted their next position. The jump had been clean. The exit point was deep in a debris field 2 systems over. Invisible, cold, and quiet. He looked at the numbers on the display, and then he looked at Kiwin. She was already working on the next calculation. Her hands moved quickly. She did not look up. Wu Ho's voice came over the internal channel from engineering, bright and a little too cheerful for the hour. Array is cycling, 22 minutes to full charge. Also, I found a small stress fracture in Junction 9, completely unrelated to what we just did, and I am fixing it right now. Before anyone asks. Janho allowed himself a very small, very brief expression that was almost a smile, then it was gone. The Veil response to Velen's destruction was exactly what Dr. Riina had predicted. She had briefed Janho 3 days into the voyage, standing at the front of the small crew room with a diagram of Veil neural architecture on the screen. Behind her in a calm, precise manner. That made everything she said sound like a fact that had always been true. She told him that the Veil were not wired for vulnerability. 600 years without a real threat had not made them careless. It had made them structurally incapable of processing the concept that something smaller than them might actually be dangerous. Their first instinct when faced with an attack they did not understand would not be caution. It would be to reach for the largest available response and apply it as fast as possible, because that had always worked before. She told him to use that. He had the Veil dispatched a rapid response fleet to the Velun site, 40 warships, the kind of force that could flatten a small moon. They found nothing to fight while they were there. The no more civility hit a Veil military shipyard, 2 systems in the opposite direction. The shipyard had been building 3 cruisers. All 3 were destroyed on the dock, along with the dock itself and the automated defense platform surrounding it. The whole operation took 11 minutes. The 40-ship response fleet turned around and jumped toward the shipyard. They found nothing. By the time they arrived at the shipyard, Wu had already rebuilt the array's power coupling from scratch. Kiwan had plotted 4 separate exit routes from their current position, and Salmon had selected the next target from the list they had built during the voyage: a fuel depot, then a communications relay array, then a forward command post that coordinated patrol schedules for 6 border sectors, then a weapons storage facility that the Veil had never bothered to heavily defend because no one had ever reached it before. Each strike was different. Each one hit something the Veil had not thought to prioritize. Junho had spent the 3-week voyage studying every piece of intelligence Earth Command had on Veil military infrastructure, not looking for the biggest targets, but for the most connected ones. He did not want to hurt them. He wanted to confuse them, exhaust them, make them turn in circles, chasing a ship they could not find, responding to attacks that were already over by the time they heard about them. He wanted them afraid before they understood why it was working. Inside the Veil High Conclave, the mood had shifted from irritation to something quieter and less comfortable. Ambassador Rashin, who had authored the livestock message with such easy confidence, now sat in closed sessions that ran past midnight, listening to military commanders argue about what was happening and why their standard responses were not stopping it. The words they kept using were the wrong ones: anomaly, isolated, temporary, manageable, asterisk. They were still trying to fit what was happening into a shape they recognized. Riina had warned Janho about this too. She said the Veil would be the last ones to name what they were actually feeling, because they had no recent experience of it. She was right. On the 23rd day, a Veil scout ship briefly got a sensor reading on the asterisk, no more civility. Before she jumped, the reading lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the scout was able to record her hull configuration, her energy signature, and one other thing: the name printed on her side in plain block letters. The scout pilot filed his report. The report was read by 6 people before it reached the conclave. Each of those 6 people independently looked at the name for a long moment and then looked away, because there was something in the plainness of it that bothered them in a way they could not immediately explain. No more civility. It was not a threat. It was not a boast, it was a statement. Of fact, clean and simple and without any room for misunderstanding. It said everything about the people who had sent the ship and nothing about fear, because people who were afraid did not name their weapons like that. By the time that report reached the top of the conclave's review stack, the no more civility had already moved again. She was deep in veil space now, further than any human ship had ever gone, moving through the dark with the quiet, unhurried patience of something that had already decided how this was going to end. It was only beginning to understand what that meant. The Veil called it the Eternal Tide. 400 warships, the largest single military deployment the Dominion had made in 3 centuries. It stretched across the sensor grid like a wall, a slow, massive, deliberate wall that was moving through space with the confidence of something that had never once needed to hurry. Their formation was tight and layered shields overlapped, firing arcs covered every approach vector. They had done the calculations, run the simulations, reviewed every piece of data they had on the human ship, and they had concluded with great certainty that 400 warships was not just enough. It was more than enough. It was a statement. It said, "We are not fighting you, we are ending you." The no more civility detected them at long range and did not change course. Kiwen ran the numbers 3 times. She got the same answer all 3 times. She looked at Jun-Ho and reported the count in a flat, steady voice, the way she had learned to report things that were very large and very serious, without weight, without hesitation, just the fact placed cleanly in the air between them. Jun-Ho stood at the center of the bridge with his hands behind his back and looked at the display. The fleet filled the screen. He looked at it the way a person looks at weather, nodding it, measuring it, deciding what to wear. Salmon was already at her station. Her fingers moved across the controls slowly, checking each system in sequence, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. She had been awake for 19 hours. She did not look tired. She looked focused in the particular way that people who have lost a very great deal learn to look when the moment they have been waiting for finally arrives. Wu-Ho and LT Unc and GT's voice came from engineering. Array is at full charge. All secondary systems are green. I have also made coffee if anyone wants some, though I understand the timing is not ideal. Nobody answered him. He had not expected them to. He settled back into his seat and kept his eyes on the power readings. Dr. Riina was at her station near the back of the bridge. She was not a combat officer and had no weapons to manage, but Jun-Ho had asked her to stay on the bridge during the engagement. She understood why. She was there to think the way the Veil thought, to anticipate what 400 captains trained in Dominion doctrine would do when things started going wrong for them. Jan-Ho turned to Kiwen. "Open a broadcast channel," he said. "Wide frequency. I want everything that happens in the next hour recorded and transmitted to Earth Command in real time." Kiwen looked up briefly. "They'll see it too, the Veil and everyone else monitoring this sector." "I know," Jan-Ho said. She opened the channel without another word. He did not speak into it. He did not make a speech or issue warning or give the Veil fleet any opportunity to prepare themselves for what was coming. The channel was not for them, it was for every other civilization watching on their sensors. Every neutral species, every Dominion Client state that had spent years pretending not to notice what the Dominion did to smaller peoples. He wanted them to see this, not the destruction, the method. He wanted them to understand exactly what humanity had spent 10,000 years building. Kiwan, he said quietly, first jump, the no more. Civility dropped into FTL and came back. Out inside the Veil Formation. Not at the edge, not at a safe approach. Distance. Inside, deep in the middle of the fleet, surrounded on every side. Exactly where no ship was supposed to be able to go, because every tactical model in existence said that micro-jumping into a dense formation was a guaranteed collision. The Veil had never done it. It had never occurred to them that anyone would. Wuho had spent 11 years making sure it was possible. He had run the simulation 4,216 times. He had the number memorized. He had never told anyone else the number because he thought it would worry them. The array fired the moment they dropped out of FTL. The cradle breaker did not fire like a beam or a missile. It fired like an idea, a specific targeted disruption that hit a ship's own defensive systems and flipped them. Shields inverted, point defense arrays turned inward. Power cores received signals from their own command systems, telling them to do things power cores were never meant to do. The three Veil cruisers closest to the no more civility did not explode dramatically. They simply stopped all at once, every system simultaneously failing in a cascade that took about 4 seconds from start to finish. 4 seconds was a very short time. It was also, Janho had noted during the planning phase, exactly long enough. Jump, he said. They were gone before the rest of the fleet could return fire. They reappeared 40 degrees off the fleet port side. Salmon fired the secondary systems, resonance disruptors, and electromagnetic cascade mines, the latter of which Wuho had spent 3 weeks placing into small stealth drones that were now releasing them throughout the formation like seeds. The Veil fleet began to turn, all 400 ships trying to reorient toward a target that was no longer where it had been. Jump, they came back in from above the formation center. The array fired again, 3 more ships than the jump, then back in. From the rear, Salmon was running the secondary weapons constantly, now every pass seeding more mines into the formation, every disruption pulse adding to the accumulating chaos inside the Veil fleet as captains lost communication with each other, as ships moved to intercept and found nothing, as the carefully overlapping firing arcs that had looked so solid on the sensor grid began to fold into each other. The Veil started firing. Of course they did. They were trained soldiers, and they were not cowards, and they had 400 ships, but they were firing at a position the no more civility had already left, and 2 of their own ships were now in that position, and the fleet's communication relay had been hit by a cascade mine 17 minutes into the engagement, and the orders being issued from the flagship were arriving late and partial, and sometimes not at all. Riina watched the sensor data and spoke quietly to Janho. The flagship is trying to break formation and reset. If they manage it, they'll stabilize. How long? 6 minutes, maybe less. She won. Already plotted, she said. They jumped directly in front of the flagship. Array charged in 3 seconds. Salmon fired. In 4, the flagship shields inverted, collapsed, and the vessel went dark and silent in a way that was somehow worse than an explosion. A thing that large, going that quiet that fast, the eternal tide held together for 9 more minutes. After that, then the first ship broke from formation, then 3 more, then the edge of the fleet began to come apart the way a wall comes apart when the foundation is gone, not all at once, but steadily, piece by piece, each piece making the next one easier. When the last 69 ships jumped away, the no more civility was sitting alone in the middle of what had been the greatest fleet the Veal Dominion had assembled in 300 years. The broadcast channel was still open. Jun-Ho let the silence run for a full minute, then he said 2 words into it, simply and without drama for whoever was listening across the sector: "We're done." He meant the battle. The Veil would spend a long time wondering if he meant something larger. The Veil Dominion had not fractured in 600 years, it fractured. Now it did not happen loudly. There was no single moment, no declaration, no dramatic split that could be pointed to later as the thing that broke it. It happened the way old structures fail, quietly from the inside, stress building in places no one had bothered to check, because no one had ever imagined the load would be tested. The client species that had spent decades under Dominion protection began running their own calculations. The math had changed. Thing they had paid tribute to deferred to shape their foreign policy around. That thing had just lost 331 warships to a single human vessel, and the 69 ships that made it back were not talking about regrouping. They were talking about what they had seen, and what they had seen had the particular quality of things that cannot be unseen. 3 client species submitted formal petitions for diplomatic independence. Within the first week, 2 more declared neutrality before the week was out. The Authority Collective, which had maintained a careful distance from both humanity and the Dominion for the better part of a century, sent a brief and politely worded message to Earth Command, asking whether humanity was open to contact. The message was notable mostly for its tone, which was respectful in a way that messages to Earth had never quite been before. Inside the Dominion, Ambassador Rashi moved through corridors that had recently been full of easy confidence, and were now full of something that no one wanted to name. He attended emergency sessions of the High Conclave, where the language used was still careful and formal, but the eyes of the people using it told a different story. He listened to military commanders explain with great technical detail how the engagement at Velshara had gone wrong, and he noticed that none of them used the word defeat. They said asterisk. Tactical reversal asterisk, they said. Unexpected asymmetric engagement. They said asterisk systemic communication. Failure and asterisk navigational. Anomaly in enemy approach vectors. They used every word they could find except the honest one. He had written the livestock message himself. He remembered the ease with which he had written it. Sitting at his desk, the words coming quickly, not even pausing to review the language before sending it. He thought about that now in the sessions that ran past midnight, and he did not share the thought with anyone. On the 11th day after the battle, he formally requested an audience with Earth Command. Admiral Dehan received the request, read it once, set it aside, and went back to work. On the 2nd day, she received a follow-up message, more urgent in tone. She set that aside too. On the 5th day, she received a 3rd message, and this one had a quality that was Different from the others, something. Careful and strained underneath the formal language, the way a person sounds when they are trying very hard not to let you hear that they are afraid. She read it 3 times, then she scheduled the meeting for 6 days later at a time and location of her choosing and sent back a confirmation with no additional words. Ration arrived with 2 aides in a prepared statement that was 30 pages long. Dayan arrived alone. She let him talk for a long time. He spoke about the historical context of Dominion-human relations. He spoke about miscommunication and cultural differences in how military actions were classified and understood. He spoke about a path forward, about cooperation, about the mutual benefits of a normalized relationship between their peoples. He spoke well. He had been doing this for 40 years, and he knew how to fill a room with words that moved in the right direction. Dayan waited until he finished, then she opened a single file on the display between them. She pressed play. Gon's voice filled the room. It was the same flat, steady voice from the black box recording, unhurried, clear reading names, the way someone reads a list of things that matter enormously and must not be lost, street by street, building by building, the schools, the hospital, the university, with its second building that had been open for 2 months. She let it play for 3 minutes. The room was very quiet. One of Ration's aides looked at the table. The other looked at the wall. Ration himself looked at the display, and his face went through several things in those 3 minutes that his diplomatic training had never fully prepared him for. Dayan unstopped the recording. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, then she said in the same tone she might use to discuss a supply schedule. The ship is still out there. I want you to understand that it does not come home until we decide it does. You do not get to decide that. You do not get to decide anything about this. What you can do is listen. She slid a single document across the table. These are our terms. They are not negotiable. They are not a starting position. Read them, take them back, and do not send me another 30 pages. She stood up, picked up her things, and left. Ration sat in the room for a while. After she was gone, his aides did not speak. The document sat on the table between them, thin and plain and very final looking. Aboard the asterisk, no more civility. Janho received the diplomatic intercepts the same evening. He read them in his cabin alone, taking his time going through each one carefully. When he was done, he went to the crew room where Salmon and Kiwan and Wu Ho were sitting in the particular way people sit when they are tired, in a deep place that sleep does not fully reach. Rihanna was reading at the end of the table. He told them what was happening, the fracturing of the Dominion, the petitions, the meeting with Ration. He laid it out plainly without embellishment and let them sit with it. Wu Ho was quiet, which was unusual. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands and looked at the table. Salmon said nothing. She had her arms folded and her eyes on the wall, and her expression was the expression of someone doing arithmetic that does not come out to a satisfying number. It was Kiwan who spoke. She was the youngest of them, and she sometimes asked things the others had decided not to ask out loud because she had not yet learned to leave certain questions alone. Is it enough? She said. 4.3 million people. Is any of this ever going to be enough? The room was quiet. Janho looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Gon's voice on the Recording, he thought about the 41 minutes, he thought about a university with a second building that had been open for 2 months. No, he said it won't be. That's not what this was for. He did not look away from her. Nothing we do brings them back. Nothing closes that number. What this was for, what all of it was for, is so that someone sitting in a room somewhere planning something like heathen runs the calculation and stops, not because it's wrong, because they're afraid of what comes next. We didn't do this for justice, we did it so there is never a 4.3 million in one. Kiwen looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded very slowly and looked back at the table. The room stayed quiet after that, but it was a different kind of quiet, not empty, not unresolved. Kind of quiet that settles over people when something large and heavy has been said out loud and acknowledged and set down. Outside, the stars moved slowly past the small window at the end of the crew room, cold and many and indifferent, the way stars always are. The ship held her course, steady and dark, waiting for the word that would finally let her go home. It was almost time. The word came on a Tuesday morning. It arrived in Janho's cabin as a single line of encrypted text from Admiral Dayan, short enough to read in one breath. It said that the Dominion had signed. It said the terms had been accepted without modification. It said that Earth Command was satisfied for now, that what needed to be established had been established, and at the very end, after all the formal language, there were 2 plain words that were not part of any official message and were not recorded in any official log: come home. Junho sat with it for a while. He read it twice, then he folded the display and got up and walked to the bridge, and he told Kiwen to plot a course back to Omega 9. She did not ask any questions. She pulled up the nav board and began working, and within a few minutes the no more civility turned in the dark and pointed herself toward home for the first time since she had left. Voyage back took 9 days. They were quiet days mostly. The crew moved through the ship in the unhurried way people move when the work is done and the body has finally been given permission to be tired. Wuho spent most of it in engineering, running diagnostics and cataloging every system that had taken stress during the campaign, filling reports with the careful thoroughness of a man who loved his ship and wanted to know exactly what she had caused. Riina wrote she had been keeping notes throughout the whole operation, not a journal exactly, more a clinical record of things she had observed and wanted to think about more carefully later. She wrote for long stretches in her small cabin and came out for meals looking like someone who had been somewhere far away in her mind and was slowly making the trip back. Salmon slept, not the shallow, interrupted sleep of the weeks before and after he, when rest had been a thing she went through the motions of without ever really arriving at real sleep, long and deep and dark, the kind that leaves a person heavy and slow and blank in the morning in a way that is not unpleasant. She slept 10 hours on the first night and 11 on the second, and on the third morning she came to the crew room for breakfast and sat down and ate a full meal and looked out the window at the stars for a while without any particular expression on her face. It was the most ordinary she had looked since the day she came aboard. Kiwi navigated. She always had something to check, something to refine, small adjustments to make to their course that probably did not need to be made but gave her hands something useful to do. On the 6th night she stayed on the bridge long after her shift ended, sitting in the navigator's seat with the lights low and the stars very bright through the forward window. Junho found her there when he came in. For a late check, he did not ask her why. She was still up. He sat down in the captain's chair and they stayed there together in the quiet for a long time. Not talking, just watching the stars move, and that was enough. Omega 9 appeared on the long-range sensors on the 9th morning. By the time they were close enough to see it properly, it was early evening and the whole crew was on the bridge, not because anyone had asked them to be, but because it seemed like the right place to be at the end of something. Nobody said much. The docking bay opened to receive them, and Kiwan brought the ship in smooth and level and set her down without a sound, the way she always did, with the quiet precision of someone who had always known exactly where things belonged. There were no crowds, there was no ceremony, no gathered press, no line of officers waiting at the bottom of the ramp with medals and speeches and cameras. There was just the dock, wide and gray and lit with the flat industrial light of a working facility, and Admiral Dehean standing alone at the base of the ramp with her hands at her sides. The crew came down one at a time. Dehean shook each of their hands. She did not say much, a few words to each of them, quiet enough that no one else could hear. Whatever she said to Salmon made Salmon close her eyes briefly and nod. Whatever she said to Kiwan made the younger woman stand a little straighter. Wuho she held by the hand with both of hers for a moment longer than they others, and he looked at the floor and cleared his throat and then made a small joke that made neither of them laugh, but both of them something close to it. Riina was the second to last. She and Dehean spoke for a moment in low voices, and then Riina walked away into the facility with her bag over her shoulder and did not look back, which was exactly her way. Junho came last. He walked down the ramp slowly, not because he was reluctant, but because he was looking at the ship. He turned when he reached the bottom and looked back at her. The way you look at something you want to remember accurately, not the idea of it, but the actual specific thing with all its damage and its weight and its particular shape against the light. Her hull was marked in a dozen places, the armor plating scorched and dented from the campaign. She looked like what she was. She had not tried to be anything else. Dayan stood beside him and looked at the ship with him for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket and took out a sealed envelope and held it out. He took it. On the front was a printed label identifying it as the official Earth Command After Action report for the operation, classified at the highest level, not to be opened for 50 years. Junho looked at the word asterisk proportional in the document title for a moment. A very small expression crossed his face, brief and private, and then it was gone. He tucked the envelope into his jacket and walked with Dayan out of the docking bay without looking back again. On KO's 7, construction began on a memorial. It took 6 years to build. It was a single column of white stone tall enough to be seen from the edge of the settlement, set in the ground at the center of what had been the colony's main square. The names of the 4.3 million were carved into it, every single one in letters small enough that reading the whole thing from top to bottom would take days. There was nothing else on the stone, no dates, no images, no official language from any government or military body, just the names one after another, carved deep and clean and permanent. At the base of the memorial sometime in the week before the official opening ceremony, someone placed a small metal plaque on the ground. It was plain and dark and had no markings that identified who had made it or who had left it there. No camera recorded who set it down. No record existed of its installation. It was simply there one morning when the workers arrived, sitting flat against the stone base of the memorial as if it had always been there. It said they thought we would mourn quietly, the crew of NMC 00001. Nobody ever claimed it. Nobody ever needed to. Far away in the secured wing of Shipyard Omega 9, the No More Civility sat in her dry dock berth in the dark. She was never recommissioned. She was never officially listed on any public naval record. She simply stayed present, intact, waiting with the particular patience of something that has already done the thing it was made for and knows without needing to be told that the world is different because of it. And for a very long time after that, nobody came for humanity again.